You can't even afford a house, Rachel. What do you do all day?" My brother chuckled, raising his wine glass like he'd said something clever. My sister flipped her glossy hair over her shoulder and added with a smirk, "Not everyone can be the queen of the business world." Laughter rippled around the room. Even my mother let out a soft chuckle, though she tried to disguise it behind her napkin. My father, ever the enabler, clinked his glass with my sisters and said, "Some people were just born to succeed." I sat at the end of the dining table, alone in every sense of the word. The expensive chandelier above us flickered slightly, casting golden light over their smug faces. The family conference, a dinner my parents insisted we have every few months, always felt more like a performance than a reunion. This time, I was the designated punchline. They didn't know that my rent was current, that I'd paid off my student loans, or that I'd turned down help because I never wanted to owe them anything. All they saw was that I wasn't posting luxury vacations or business class flights on Instagram, and that was enough for them to judge me as less. In the past, I would have defended myself, maybe thrown in a quiet protest or a half-hearted joke to deflect. But not tonight. Tonight I smiled, and I stayed silent, because tonight something shifted. I wasn't just hurt, I was done. Done hoping for approval that was never coming. Done bending so I could fit into a family portrait that never had room for me. My silence wasn't weakness. It was clarity, a kind of calm I hadn't felt in years. They thought they had one, that their words had crushed me, but all they did was reveal how small they were and how little I owed them. As they poured more wine and laughed louder, I leaned back and watched like a quiet storm gathering behind glass. They had no idea that the girl they mocked was about to remind them who she really was, and what she actually owned. And it all started with silence. I didn't become quiet overnight. As I sat at that family table, the laughter fading into background noise, memories swirled like ghosts around me. They weren't loud, they were subtle, persistent. 100 tiny cuts that never fully healed. I was 10 when I first understood I was the other daughter. My sister, Lily, had just won some school contest, spelling bee, I think. Balloons, cake, a new dress. I came home with a handmade painting that got hung on the fridge for about 2 hours until Lily brought home her trophy. Then it was quietly taken down, never mentioned again. At 13, I got straight A's for the first time. My father glanced at the report card and muttered, "That's good, but Lily already did that last year." I nodded, pretending I wasn't hoping for a simple, "I'm proud of you." By 16, I'd stopped bringing things home at all. Art projects, writing competitions, volunteer hours. None of it mattered unless it sparkled the way Lily did. She was the golden one, the one they showed off at dinner parties and in Christmas letters. Meanwhile, I learned to be quiet, helpful, responsible. The nice one, which really just meant the one they didn't worry about. The one they could forget until something needed doing. Sacrifices became second nature. I gave up field trips when money was tight. Skipped prom so Lily could buy the designer dress she wanted. Took a job in college to cover books because Dad said we're already stretched with Lily's internship expenses. Back then, I swallowed every injustice like it was normal. Like it was love. But it wasn't love. It was convenience. And now, sitting in this room full of people who still saw me as the invisible daughter, I felt it. Not just the pain, but the fire. I used to ache for their approval. Now, I realized I didn't need it. I never did. Every slight, every cold shoulder, every moment they made me feel small, it didn't break me. It built me. Quietly. Fiercely. They made me tough without knowing it. So when they laughed at me tonight, I didn't shrink. I remembered. And I sat up straighter. They thought my silence meant defeat. But it wasn't silence. It was power. The power of someone who spent her entire life learning to endure. Who finally realized she doesn't have to anymore. I wasn't the second best daughter. I was the woman they never saw coming. I left the family gathering before dessert. No dramatic exit. No thrown wine glass. Just a quiet push of my chair, polite "thanks for dinner," and the sound of my heels on the marble floor as I walked away from people who never really saw me. Outside, the night was sharp and cold. I paused on the front steps, looking up at the house that had once been home, but now just felt like a monument to everything I was never allowed to be. My heart was pounding, not from sadness, but from something else. Something I couldn't name yet. I got in my car and sat in silence for a while, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My mascara had smudged just slightly under my eyes. My face looked tired but focused. I wasn't crying. Not tonight. That surprised me. Humiliation has a strange way of clearing things up. The laughter still rang in my ears, but so did something else. The sound of my own silence. It hadn't been a surrender. It had been a decision. For years, I'd bent myself in half to earn scraps of acknowledgement. I sacrificed time, comfort, even self-respect, trying to prove I was worth being proud of. But that night, it all snapped. Not in anger, not in rage, but in purpose. I went home, kicked off my shoes, made a cup of tea, and opened my laptop. On the screen were the files I'd been building quietly for years. Business plans, property leads, rental contracts. Side hustles, investments, learning platforms I'd taken at midnight while working a 9 to 5. While Lily flaunted luxury brands and company launches handed to her by our parents' connections, I'd been building quietly, imperfectly, but with grit. And they had no idea. I revisited the plan I'd shelved months ago because I was too scared, too tangled in what if they think I am a failure. That night, I opened it with fresh eyes. Something inside me clicked. The rejection wasn't a dead end. It was a beginning. Every insult they'd thrown, every backhanded compliment, every time they called me responsible like it was a curse, it all turned to fuel. I wasn't going to try to impress them anymore. I was going to surpass them. And I wouldn't need applause when I did. That night, something shifted in me. The girl who used to crave their approval was gone. In her place stood someone else. Someone sharper, bolder, and no longer afraid. I didn't need them to see me. I needed to see myself. And finally I did. They never asked how I was doing. Not really. At birthdays, they'd ask if I was still working that little job, and I'd nod. No one asked what it really took to pay my rent, keep my fridge stocked, and cover my student loans. No one asked how tired I was or how long I stayed up studying after working a double shift. They just assumed I was fine. I was always the independent one. Translation, not worth worrying about. What they didn't know was that behind the quiet nods and the fake smiles, I was building something. At 23, I was juggling 2 jobs. During the day, I was an assistant property manager, answering calls, fixing tenant issues, learning the gritty side of real estate from the ground up. At night, I served tables. I walked home with aching feet and reeking clothes, but a heavier tip night could mean groceries for the week, or more importantly, another $100 into my someday fund. They didn't know about the notebook I kept under my mattress, filled with scribbled ideas, market stats, and dreams that scared me, or the free YouTube courses I watched at 2 a.m., eyes half shut, learning how to analyze property values and rental yields. They didn't know that at 25, I bought my first tiny duplex. It wasn't glamorous. The paint was peeling, the wiring outdated, and the neighbors suspicious. But it was mine. I had saved $12,000 over 3 years, found a desperate seller, and negotiated like my life depended on it. Because it did. I lived in one unit, rented the other. Every spare dollar went back into it. I patched walls, refinished cabinets, painted ceilings by hand. No one in my family knew. I never told them. They'd only laugh or find a way to dismiss it. Then, 18 months later, I sold that property for almost double what I'd paid. That was the moment it began. From there, I bought another. Then a third. I lived below my means, invested every spare cent, and kept learning. By 28, I owned 6 properties. Some small, some struggling, but they were mine. I managed them myself, signed the leases, called the plumbers, dealt with midnight emergencies. Every time they called Lily a business genius, I was handling evictions and writing up contracts. And I never once brought it up at family dinners. Not because I was ashamed, but because I realized they'd never cared enough to ask. They didn't see me. Not really. I could have told them I owned 10 buildings, and they'd still ask how Lily's new social media campaign was going. So I stopped needing them to notice. I built in silence. I grew in silence. And one day, the empire they ignored would become the ground they stood on. They had no idea, but they would. I smiled at the conference table, but behind my smile lived 1,000 quiet battles. As they laughed and passed judgment on my life, I kept thinking, you've never asked me a single real question. Not once. Not when I skipped prom because we couldn't afford the dress. Not when I worked double shifts while still helping out at home. Not even when I disappeared from family dinners for months. They never checked in, never called. And when I did show up, they'd only ask, still single or still renting? Always followed by a smirk. They assumed the worst, then made a punchline. They never asked if I was happy, or scared, or surviving. They didn't notice the weight I lost from stress or how often I checked my phone during those family dinners. Not because I was distracted, but because I was coordinating with contractors, closing deals, and putting out fires. They never saw the woman behind the silence. So I let them talk. I let my sister flaunt her new Range Rover and her Instagram followers. I let my mom boast about Lily's PR empire and how she basically saved the whole building. I didn't even flinch when my father said, "Thank God we didn't leave this place to Rachel. She can barely keep a savings account." They had no idea. That building they loved to mention? The one Lily took selfies in front of, boasting about renovation partnerships. That was mine. It had been mine for 8 months. I bought it through a silent LLC. My name didn't scream from any signs, but it whispered where it mattered most, on the title deed. And not just that building. 3 others in the same zip code bore my signature. Quietly, steadily, I built the ground they stood on. Literally. They loved the penthouse view. I paid for that elevator maintenance. The lobby chandelier they adored. I signed off on the invoice. The lease renewal they bragged about negotiating. It went through my property manager. The irony was poetic. They were so eager to dismiss me, yet lived in the comfort I'd created. And no, I didn't tell them. Not yet. I wasn't after applause. I didn't want their validation. I wanted peace. And owning that building gave me more peace than their compliments ever could. What they saw was a quiet, unmarried woman in thrifted clothes. What they didn't see was the title deed folded neatly in my purse. What they never asked about was the journey I took to become the woman sitting across from them, unbothered, unimpressed, and in control. I didn't need to yell or argue. I had already won, not with words, with deeds, and they would soon find out just how much they underestimated the woman they thought was barely getting by. It was a Sunday dinner, one of those obligatory family gatherings where tension hung in the air like smoke. The table was full, roasted chicken, laughter, and little digs disguised as jokes. I was seated at the end, like always, quietly eating, nodding when spoken to, smiling just enough to pass unnoticed. Lily was in her usual spotlight. She had just flown in from Dubai. Business class, of course, she made sure to mention 3 times. Mom laughed a little too loudly. Dad asked her about the big deal she was working on, even though he hadn't said a word to me all evening. Then came the jab. Lily raised her wine glass and smirked. To success. Some of us just have the magic touch. Others, well, still renting and pinching pennies, I guess. Her eyes slid to me, full of syrupy venom. Laughter erupted. Even Dad chuckled. I didn't flinch. I didn't defend myself. I just set my fork down, wiped my mouth with the cloth napkin, and looked straight at Lily. Then I spoke, calm, measured, and almost bored. You should really be nicer to your landlord. The table quieted, confused. I tilted my head and added, I own the building you live in. It was like someone had cut the power to the whole room. No one spoke. Forks hovered midair. Eyes widened in slow, synchronized disbelief. Even Lily froze, her wine glass halfway to her lips. You what? Dad finally said, blinking. I repeated it, slower this time. I own the building. The one with the curved glass front. You signed a lease with my property management company. My name's not on it. Smart legal move, but it's mine. Silence. It wasn't angry silence. It wasn't awkward silence. It was power-shifting silence. For the first time, I watched my mother's smirk disappear. Lily's perfect posture faltered. Dad, the one who always looked past me like I was invisible, looked right at me, really looked, and I saw it in his eyes. The realization, the shock, the regret. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice or roll my eyes. I just leaned back in my chair, calm, composed, and still. I've owned it for almost a year, I added. The elevator you use? I pay for its maintenance. The gym you brag about on Instagram? I approved the renovation budget. The rent discount you negotiated with such pride. I smiled. I signed off on that. You're welcome. Still no one spoke. And it was in that moment, that perfect silence, I understood the power of quiet success. I didn't need them to clap or apologize. I had already won. I stood, picked up my purse and said, "Dinner was lovely. Enjoy the building." Then I walked out, not angry, not bitter, but victorious. They had laughed at me for years. But now, they were living under my roof. The phone didn't stop buzzing the next day. After that dinner, after I had said those words that had stunned the room, I knew the calls would come. But this time, I wasn't going to answer them with tears or anger. I wasn't going to explain myself or even give them a chance to apologize. I was done. Done fighting for their love. Done begging for their approval. This was no longer about them. It was about me. And I didn't owe them anything. First, it was Mom. Her message was soft, coated in guilt. "Rachel, please, we need to talk. We didn't know you felt this way. You've always been so quiet about your feelings. I'm sorry, please let's talk." I read it, felt that familiar sting of sorrow, but I didn't feel a rush to answer. I didn't need her to apologize. I didn't need to hear her regret. I had spent my entire life chasing after love that always seemed conditional, always dependent on what I could give them. Not anymore. I stared at the phone, feeling the weight of her words press on me, but the silence that followed felt different now. Stronger, more certain. My heart no longer begged for their approval. It simply beat with the knowledge that I didn't have to answer them anymore. I hit ignore. Then came Dad. His message was blunt with an undertone of frustration. "We miss you, Rachel. We've been through too much for this. Can't we fix this? Please don't shut us out." The message stung, but only for a moment. He still didn't get it. Still, he saw me as someone he could fix, someone he could control with his words. I didn't answer him. I didn't owe them anything. I had already given them more than enough. I had been the daughter who never asked for anything in return, the one who would do anything to keep the peace, even if it meant losing pieces of myself. But that ended now. Lily called next. Her voice cracked with emotion. "Rach, Mom and Dad are really upset. You're pushing us all away. Please just come home. Let's talk this through. You don't need to do this alone." I didn't respond to her either. I didn't need to do anything with them. I was fine. I was more than fine. The peace I had been craving, the one that had eluded me for so long, had finally settled in. I wasn't angry. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was done. I had worked too hard to get to this point to let them drag me back into their chaos. It was quiet now. The phone still buzzed. They had no idea that I had already made my decision, that the distance I was putting between us wasn't a punishment. It was my way of protecting myself. My peace was mine to keep, not for them to take. The messages continued to come, one after the other, but I didn't read them. I didn't need to. I didn't owe them my time or my energy anymore. I was strong. I was proud. And I was calm. My silence was my power now. It wasn't to hurt them. It was to finally take control of my own life, my own boundaries. I had no regrets, no apologies, just peace. A year had passed since that dinner, the one where I dropped the bomb that shook them all, the one where I had finally taken a stand. I hadn't looked back since. Everything had changed, and yet in some ways it hadn't. I was no longer the quiet, apologetic daughter who always felt the weight of everyone's expectations. I was me, just Rachel, and that was enough. I didn't need their applause. In fact, I hadn't even thought about their reactions for months. My life had evolved so much that their approval was no longer the measure by which I defined myself. Success didn't taste like revenge. It didn't taste like "I told you so." It tasted like freedom, like the satisfaction of building something for myself. I had built my own empire, slowly, quietly, without anyone cheering me on. I didn't need anyone to tell me I was doing well. I knew it. The investments I had made, those small, strategic moves in real estate that I once kept to myself, had paid off. The buildings I owned now weren't just assets. They were the foundation of my independence. They were proof of what I was capable of when I finally stopped waiting for permission to live life on my own terms. The quiet, unassuming growth of my wealth didn't even register with my family. They couldn't see it because I wasn't chasing after them anymore. I was chasing after something far greater, self-worth. And with every check that came in, with every deal I closed, I felt more connected to the woman I had become. I moved into a new apartment, one that was mine, decorated exactly how I wanted. It was small but full of light. I could breathe here, really breathe. No more pretending to be someone I wasn't. No more pushing down my needs just to keep the peace. It felt good to just be. One afternoon, as I sat in my living room sipping coffee, my phone buzzed with a notification. A property I had been watching had been sold. Another one of my investments had turned into a success. But the real success wasn't in the money. It was in the feeling of owning my own decisions, owning my life. And then a message came in. It was from Lily. The first message I had received from her in months. Ratch, I heard about the latest sale. Mom and Dad were talking. They're finally admitting they were wrong. I'm sorry. I should have been there for you. I don't expect anything, but can we try to talk soon? I paused for a moment. That familiar ache tugged at my chest, but it didn't overwhelm me like it used to. It was a recognition that I had healed. I wasn't angry with them anymore, but I wasn't desperate for their approval either. I didn't respond, not because I was cold or unforgiving, but because I had already won. I had built a life that was mine, and that was all I needed. The poetic justice, the moment when they realized that I had grown stronger without them, that was just a bonus. I had everything I wanted, not because I was chasing revenge or trying to prove something, but because I had finally found my own worth. And that was enough.